Welcome. I'm Joshua Bloom. I'm a partner in the Mountain View office of Simon Kucher and Partners. Just one slide background on the company I come from. We're a marketing and strategy consulting firm, 31 offices worldwide, 800 employees, and we really focus on the topics revolving around pricing. That's really how we're known. So if you think about the volume of activity, 3,200 projects in the last 3 years alone, over half of which were pricing projects, and licensing is obviously very tied up in those issues as well, especially when you get to the technology sector. And I lead the software team out of the US. We're organized by industries, so I will try to actually expand my talk beyond just software and security type sectors to bring in other examples. But if people want to connect with industry experts outside, I can always connect you. Okay, so what do I want to talk about today? Pricing model flexibility as a competitive weapon. I think that's the title. I really do see it that way. Fundamentally, I've worked with about 50 companies in the last 5 years, tech companies here in the Valley, and the ones that really embrace kind of changing models are the ones who can pick up additional kind of incremental business. That's usually the tougher side of pricing, right? Most pricing exercises are built around, can we get an additional few percentage points in gross margin, et cetera. I tend to work with companies that are focused more on how can we use pricing as a way to not just extract value, but win more deals. So that's really the focus today. And I'll give a little bit of context about why we see some of the trends that we're seeing and some of the pressures that companies are facing. I'll start with just kind of macro trends. You might have seen talk from my colleague Matt Johnson yesterday, talked about the global pricing study. We survey a few thousand executives every year, pricing trends across different countries and industries. And some of the high-level findings, most companies are under increasing pricing pressure. They see themselves in a price war, and they are really poor at implementing price increases. So I'm more focused on what companies do to get out of that trap. If those are the kind of the conditions they're under, how do they try to escape those oppressive market conditions? And the second most common response when we look at that is that companies revisit their revenue model. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. Pricing, licensing model flexibility, looking at different ways of creating customer agreements that rethink your revenue model. So raise your hand if your company has considered changing their pricing model in the past. Okay, about half the room. That's actually a little low. When we ask companies in the global pricing study, again across all industries, whether they have considered changing their pricing model, a solid 2/3 are split between those that say yes, they're actively planning some type of pricing model change, and those that have a vague initiative or have tried and maybe not gotten that off the ground. It's only a third of companies that say, no, that's really not something that would help. So why are companies doing this? I'll kind of say this, I'll bring this back at 3 levels. One is kind of the macro climate, the business climate, and then the purchasing climate. At a macro level, this is something you hear in the popular press. Obviously, the increasingly tilted GDP structure towards services as opposed to physical goods. This is how a lot of companies are thinking about how they charge for the value they create. And you see that creeping up over the last 30 years. At a corporate level, Wall Street is sending signals as well. People follow the money. They follow the enterprise valuations. And right now the signals are, and this has been pretty stable, that fundamentally recurring revenue models are valued at a higher level. This is a snapshot from kind of December 31st, end of last year, where we sat with kind of revenue and EBITDA multiples for traditional software companies on the 3 left-hand sides, broken out by sectors they cover, and true kind of pure-play software as a service companies. And I think everybody understands that, okay, if you can turn a profit in a software as a service model, that's great, and that's kind of the blue bar, but actually I think the more important one here is the revenue side. Even on a dollar-for-dollar basis of top line, approximately 9x software as a service multiple for revenue versus 4 to 6x for traditional software companies shows there's that is essentially an indicator for future growth, that's where purchasing is headed. And that's really the last one I wanted to talk about, is bringing up a data point from a study I did recently where we looked at just the pure micro purchasing process, what companies are going through, what individual decision makers in companies are going through. First of all, when you ask them what their approval time is or how easy it is to get capital expenditures approved versus OpEx approved, there is a significant difference, that CapEx is becoming increasingly difficult to get approved. And there's this other dichotomy of just how different companies are thinking about purchasing in general. In kind of traditional accounting formats, you'd think of we buy an asset, we depreciate it over 5 or sometimes even 10 years. But now there's a significant number of customers, companies, more than 40% who are looking at TCO on a 3 years or lower basis. Which obviously, if you compare kind of a traditional asset purchase versus subscription purchase, they're going to say the subscription is much more attractive. Okay, so those are some of the background reasons. If I'm talking too fast, you have questions, let me know. I know I ran over last time. I might skip a couple slides. I think it's good to kind of pivot and say two things on the back half of this presentation. One, what's a framework you can use to think about this problem, something you can take back with you, something useful out of this presentation that you can apply in your business, and also to give you a couple kind of inspiring examples of companies that have really gone through with this types of licensing model changes. I'll start with one that is outside the software industry or materials industry, but it's from a wind turbine services company. And they typically signed kind of service contracts that were based just on per month, per year, but moved to true value-based pricing. They said, well, that's interesting, but the real value companies are getting out of this is the ability to keep the wind turbine spinning. So let's price per kilowatt hour, not even kind of active hour. Ultimately, it depends on the yield of the wind park. Kind of more wind is higher yield, is more value, higher price. And 90% of their customers kind of jump to this model inside 12-year contracts. It doesn't need to be a tech industry. An industry as commoditized as tires. A 19th century pricing model. We sell you a tire, or maybe you buy a replacement tire through a tire shop. Ultimately, that strangles the value of innovation. That in this case, Michelin actually created a more durable tire by 20%. Their sales force said, we can't actually get 20% more for that in a commoditized environment. So they said, okay, let's change the model. Let's work with trucking partners and figure out a miles as a service model where we can keep your truck rolling, focus on how many miles they get out of it. And that's a fundamental way to capture the value of durability. Instead of saying we have to get 20% higher price, let's say focus on the fact that, well, we can ship 20% fewer units and still get to the same results. Why are companies doing this? Fundamentally, service-based businesses can be seen as a win-win for all. It's a way for customers to predict their expenditures, for you to predict your revenue, and to create stronger relationships. On that last point, I worked with a hardware company here in the Valley. They didn't have any problems with maintenance attach rate or maintenance renewal rate. Those were all above 90%. But their key problem was every 5 years when they went through a major technology refresh, that large multi-$100,000 event was essentially a forcing function for a competitive bid review process. So they essentially had to go out for competitive bid every 5 years, and they lost 50% of the time, which for them, it was a highly fragmented market. 50% isn't bad, but is there a way around that, forcing that compelling event for competitive bid? And we started looking at alternative models. So here's the framework I'll try to sketch in the details of the last 15 minutes or so of the presentation. The way I would think about pricing model flexibility, kind of take back, is you really want to look at this along 4 dimensions. You can evaluate alternative pricing metrics, kind of how you charge. You can look at alternative packaging, as in what products you're even selling. You can look at alternative contract structures, how pricing changes with volume. And you can look at licensing, which I would drill down to say, how does pricing change over time? So let me start with the metrics piece. The metrics piece, again, when you're thinking about the metric you're going to charge to extract value, the way I would encourage people to look at this is that it has to be some type of balance between what's positive for the company, kind of meets your goals, is aligned with your cost structure, is easy for you to implement, track, and measure, is aligned with the future developments of the market. You don't want to tie yourself to a decaying metric, an organically decaying metric. Hopefully you find something that's organically growing. But you also have to sync that up with customer expectations. Is it perceived as being fair? Does it reduce their risk? And ultimately, I would boil that down to saying there are a lot of different metrics you can test. Kind of every business I've walked into, there are a lot of different ideas for how you could charge. But when you put it through the forcing function of saying, okay, how is this aligned with our ability to capture value? And what is this going to, how appealing is this going to be a customer? Even without doing customer research, you could probably get to a sketched out version of what are the ones where we actually find some overlap there, and what are the ones that are kind of corner cases that might only work for one of the two parties. That's the metric side. The packaging side, you can also look, it's a structure that doesn't necessarily always get thought of in this way, but it also has an axis of flexibility. Fundamentally, kind of an all-you-can-eat, one-size-fits-all package is not flexible. You can get into category bundling, breaking your product apart, or keeping it as a handful of category offerings. You can get to good, better, best type upsell paths, role-based packages that are targeted to specific buyer types or use cases, or even just price bundling, and of letting customers drive a lot of that constellation of what they piece together and build their own bundle. That's another dimension of flexibility. The third is contract structure. Probably an underthought element of this is just what are we actually charging? Are we charging a flat rate that doesn't depend on usage? Or are we going the extreme other direction to completely variable, just charging on a linear basis, which puts, the way I would think about this is who's taking on the risk? In a flat rate structure, the company, the vendor is taking on all the risk of how much something is used. If there are cost dimensions there, or different ways to capture value. If it's linear, great for us as a vendor, not so much for the customer. They're at kind of complete budgetary risk that could go through the roof. So usually most companies find something in between. They find some way to include kind of caps and floors, some way to have that be tiered within a range during the course of the contract so that there's some balancing of risk. And the last one here, I think that you'll probably hear a lot about this week, is licensing models, or how you measure pricing over time. And again, the kind of traditional perpetual models with maybe some maintenance stream attached to it versus term options or subscription options versus true kind of pay-per-use. Again, you can look at this on the spectrum of kind of low flexibility and high predictability to the alternative. Okay. I think, just a couple points here. I think a lot of pure software companies have grappled with this over the last decade, let's say, of saying, okay, we want to create alternatives to the traditional perpetual model. About half of software purchasing is now in alternative models. I think most people are surprised that half is still in perpetual models, but it is. I think the areas that are kind of the next frontier is a lot of what's happening with traditional hardware companies, traditional appliance companies, where there's actually more complexity in the mix. Because in addition to software assets and potentially services and support, you also have a hardware element. So that kind of spectrum of all upfront to ongoing has a couple different steps in it. Between the appliance model, you could start to unbundle your hardware and your software. You can create virtual appliances. You could create a hardware sale plus a term software license. There's a lot more degrees of flexibility, but I think companies are starting to create tools to be able to monitor those type of activities and actually enforce alternative licensing models. I'll give you one example of a company that really took this challenge to heart and saw gains from it. This is an example of a healthcare workflow software company. They were facing a lot of pressure from the customer side, where hospitals were under kind of increasing budgetary pressure. They're facing massive kind of reimbursement cuts, which really kind of shrunk IT budgets, especially CapEx budgets. New entrants, kind of cloud-first models, were coming in with more flexible pricing models. And they use that as an opportunity to kind of reassess their whole commercial structure along those 4 dimensions. Say, what are the metrics we should be looking at? How should we rearrange our functional packages? How should we reward growth among our key accounts? What are the licensing models we should offer? We spent a lot of time drawing those up, and then it's a topic I'll get back to, but we tested it. We live tested it. We piloted it, in this case, with a couple of key accounts. So this is more on the key account end of the business. I'll get into more transactional in a second. With key accounts, we basically picked 2 of their largest customers that were dual sourcing or had 3 different providers in their networks and said, let's put all of these elements on the table. Let's put metric on the table. Let's pick whether software maintenance, services, hardware, or actually CapEx or OpEx expenditures. And let's work through that together, something that works for both of us. Essentially, how could we get to single sourcing? And we found a way to do that with those 2 accounts. The results looked slightly different. They had different metrics. They both had software and maintenance as an ongoing expense, but in services, one kind of completely annualized it, one treated it as a bank of hours. Hardware, one wanted it separate, one wanted it included in kind of ongoing expenses. And we got to 2 models that worked for those 2 accounts and helped kind of, in 5x terms, kind of improve the commitment from those partnerships. So it's a case study in taking to the extreme, kind of putting everything on the table, being able to drive to more lasting relationships. There are a couple of learnings from that. One, you have to communicate the value of each piece because there's pretty much incredible sticker shock when you show one all-in price for different, what were different business lines. You have to understand the margin risk to your business when you start including things on an ongoing OpEx basis. But fundamentally, I look at that as extreme. What they've done now, after that, is they've pilot tested it with a few, and then they've coalesced around a few different standardized options that they've taken as kind of alternative licensing models to the rest of the customers. But that's one way to look at it, is start at the top. Go ahead.
Can you expand a little bit on what the margin risks look like?
The margin risks, yes. There were some scenario analysis around, in this case, it's a hospital network. So what if they acquired 5 different sites? Have we committed to implementing those on a specific timeline, et cetera, when you start to do things like include services that have real hardware, real costs associated with them. Same with hardware and support. Less on the software side. So we went through, before signing up to those numbers, everybody can get blown away by the kind of top line numbers, but it's actually, it's not too far-fetched to see those running into the red if you run some extreme assumptions. So it helped put some boundaries around that contract. Okay, we're going to do this up to this many sites, but if you acquire a footprint of this size, then we'd have to expand the contract, et cetera. Go ahead.
I want to understand a bit more on why you think percentage revenue would be attractive, and is a meaningful measure at all for a company that you say, hey, you make more money, give me more money. And then, you know, in industry, like companies, same thing, same industry, same, valuation, revenue, cannot ask for a percentage of how well they do.
Yeah, percentage of revenue, probably.
Not the ideal.
It's not that it's not the ideal. It depends on where you sit in that equation. When this was 0.1% of revenue, it's saying you're not a critical part of driving the revenue equation. But there are other examples where if you're fundamentally driving revenue growth, if you think your solution is not just mission critical, but fundamental to kind of top line growth, you might want to participate.
But is it not better to say percentage of revenue that the licensing model, the EMS model is adding the incremental value rather than
Yes.
your whole thing, your product, your innovation, your market.
In general, yes. In general, yes. I would agree with that. Yeah. Okay. Last point here, that was more the key account version of the story. I'll show one last example here from a more transactional network security company. The other way I think about this is for companies with a lot of commercial relationships and customers, you can think about culling down the risk profile of changing licensing models by changing different dials for a rollout or a pilot. So for this company, we did a lot of the background work to come up with the right models, but then to blend them into the business and fine-tune as we went along, we said there are a couple different dials at our disposal. We could offer both the old model and the new model in parallel. We could pick pilot products, pilot regions, target customer segments, or specific competitive situations. That's essentially what we did. And instead of shifting the whole business, the kind of companies that shift their whole business from one licensing model to another drive a lot of headlines, but that's not how most companies think about this. Most companies think about this as operating under some financial constraints of doing that or operational constraints and saying we need to tune this up over time. So in this case, we ended up kind of launching both models in parallel. People could buy off the old price book, essentially. We selected a few pilot products, kind of new products especially. Instead of worrying about legacy products and how customers would upgrade, we said, let's pick a couple of our new product launches to roll these out. We looked at a couple pilot regions where we felt we had more control over our channels. We looked at doing this more heavily with specific vertical reps, and essentially covering different industry segments. And the last one was, as a pure defensive mechanism, if there were negotiations where we had kind of documented proof there were subscription-based competitors who were also in the deal, the sales team had access to kind of a war room that could work up an alternative licensing model deal. So we didn't lose opportunities along the way, even as we were being targeted in our rollout. So that's the way I would encourage you to think about this. Is there's kind of a framework you can work through to think about narrowing down the alternatives in the licensing model. It's a structure, and thinking about licensing model is ultimately an opportunity from a commercial perspective to help win deals. And fundamentally, when it comes to implementation, this is something you could still kind of pilot and test and roll out. It doesn't have to be a wholesale change to the business, which is much harder to drive in most companies. So that's what I have to cover today. Hope that was helpful, and happy to take questions. Yep.
When you move from perpetual to subscription or usage-based licensing, how do you go about pricing it? I understand the metrics of rules that you talked about, but are there other rules? For example, in how many years should I make full end of one-time revenue that I would have made otherwise?
Yeah, I would say we've done benchmarking studies around that, and we've seen everything from 2 years to 5 years. Most companies are in 2.5 to 3 year zones for subscription to perpetual break even. But that's the general guidance I would give. Of course, every market might have unique competitors that have driven it in a certain way or others, or there's, especially when you get into hardware type environments, you have to think about the added complexity of what's the real lifetime of the appliance that is being sold, which could skew it in one direction or another. There are certainly kind of hardware companies have gone into where the average life cycle of an appliance is only 3 years, so that kind of pushes you towards the shorter end. And there are other ones who say, yeah, we can sell an appliance and it'll run for 10 years. That it changes a little bit where that window is for those companies. Mm-hmm. Okay. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you, in your context, how do you differentiate between the term license and the subscription license?
So these terms are used by different people in different ways. I would say a term license is, I reserve subscription usually for monthly or annual auto-renewing offerings. So I think of subscription as you're signed up for it, and you can kind of set it and forget it. whereas term licenses are usually more of, what I have here is either a 3-year term or a 5-year term or something like that. It's a longer term contract that covers multiple years. That can be a little bit of an arbitrary definition, but that's how I like to think about it. And structurally, they have different mechanics to them. Term contracts tend to look more like your traditional key account negotiations, and that you can sell through your existing Salesforce structure, et cetera. But they turn what had been one-time revenue and expense into kind of ongoing that you can recognize as recurring revenue, or for them, operating cost. Subscription models that are kind of auto-renewing almost imply a different kind of organizational structure behind it too. There's a sales force that is responsible for that initial sale, but then ultimately there's some kind of different customer organization that's responsible for keeping that customer successful and live for years afterwards. So, yep, go ahead.
One of the different business models, in addition to what good things that you mentioned, is that if you have a wind farm or solar farm, any manufacturing plant where something is produced and revenue is generated, we do a totally different thing, and we'll say, okay, we'll buy all your equipment.
Yep.
And give you cash. We will not even move your equipment. You can keep it. You can keep on using it. No change as it. And so it's initial kick of 20, 30, 40, 50, 100. The bigger the better for me.
Yep.
And so that money they can do whatever they want to do in terms of reinvestment and so on, which is probably much better kick for the customer than all these subscriptions or perpetual or whatever else, percentage of revenue and so on.
Yeah.
So they don't have any risk, and they got big cash that they can do, reinvest, whatever they want.
Yeah, there's no one silver bullet. I think that's why I kind of show the spectrum too. It's going to work for different companies. Yep. Okay. Great. Thanks, folks. People have more questions, they can come to me afterwards.